It's not a tabloid. It's a medical journal where they tell the doctors of the Nazi state, this is your job now. You have to take command. And on the right is not a Nazi party, he's not a politician. He's the head of the German Medical Association, dressed up in his Nazi uniform, firmly believing in this policy that we are going to take power, that the doctors are going to become now state leaders of the state. They are going to follow the politicians blindly into correcting what was wrong with German society. Dual loyalty, which is one of our firm ethical dilemmas that we have today. In Nazi Germany, there was no such thing as dual loyalty. The doctors were demanded of them, and they agreed that their only loyalty was to the state. They were not there was no such thing as dual loyalty. The individual patient did not matter anymore. The only important thing was the state. One of the first laws that the Nazis pass, laws, in 1933 as they come into power is the Sterilization Law, based on the American Sterilization Law, and in the poster you can see flags of other countries where it was too legal to have sterilization. And once again, the categories of who was deemed worthy of sterilization were pretty similar to the American eugenics categories. Doctor-patient confidentiality was of absolutely no importance. Nobody was asked for consent, no parents were asked for consent. There were hereditary courts to rule over these cases. Midwives and doctors had to report these cases to certain officers, where they were then sent to the courts, and on the courts, the doctors sat as judges. 3 out of the 4 judges on these hereditary courts decided who could be sterilized. We're talking about German citizens, not Jews. German citizens who were ill physically and mentally and unproductive. 400,000 of them were sterilized against their will. This is one of the most, this is like the NIH, this is one of the most sophisticated institutes in the world for human subjects research and anthropology research. They had special newspapers, the genetic doctors, to teach the doctors so that they could learn all about what was expected of them. And of course, the Jewish question came, the anti-Semitism that was part of the policy, party policy, entered the medical world as well. The man in the picture is doing twin studies. This is in 1923. This is long before the war. At one of the most sophisticated institutes in Germany is performing twin studies. His name is Professor von Verschuer. The man on the right is Joseph Mengele. That was Mengele's boss. This started in 23. They were doing genetic studies on twins already in 1923. What was amazing is that not only did they believe this, but they taught this at medical schools. When we think about the Nazi doctors, we think about them throwing their ethics out of the window and just behaving appallingly and atrociously and doing what they did without ethics. We know today that they had ethics, and not only did they have ethics, they taught ethics. They were the only country in the world that had a compulsory course for medical ethics at medical schools. Every single medical school in Nazi Germany had to teach medical ethics. What they were being taught? That's what they were being taught, that the physician has a loyalty to the state, that they were meant to be biological soldiers. This is what the students are being taught. The Jewish doctors, it was okay to take the place of Jewish doctors, that they should not treat Aryan patients and vice versa. In full support of the Sterilization Law and in full support of what I'm going to talk about now, which is even worse, which is what they called the Euthanasia Program. This is what the students were being taught at medical school. It was a compulsory subject. And then we have World War II breaks out in 1939. And together with the onset of war, Hitler sets another program in place. And this is what I told you, this was called, what they called the Euthanasia Program. This never became law. It started with these two people in the picture. One was Hitler's personal physician, who was held afterwards, was tried at Nuremberg, and the other one was his secretary, where he actually wrote a directive and gave it to these two people, who forwarded to medical directors at institutions, allowing doctors to decide which of their patients they could kill. They called it euthanasia. It was, of course, in no connection to what we know as euthanasia today. Some of them were certainly not suffering. They were just mentally retarded or physically maimed or psychiatrically ill. It never became law, as I said, and the doctors were empowered to murder their patients, together with their nursing staff, of course. The offices where they had this whole, where this establishment was formed, and where they sat and decided on the basis of forms only. They never examined the patients. Yes, whether they used to sign the forms. I think I have that's how big it was, that's how vast this organization was. It was meant to be secret at the beginning. Of course, it couldn't have been kept secret. It was such a vast organization. Most of those people and functionaries in this organization were medical professionals, nurses and doctors and hospital administrators. On the basis of forms alone, it started with children. 5,000 children were deemed eligible to be murdered by the medical staff that was meant to care for these sick people. Doctors supervised it was a very complicated system where they were transported to certain hospitals to be murdered. Special wards were formed for this operation to be carried out. Doctors supervised the transportation of these patients. As you can see, the buses were painted over so that the people living in the area would not know what was going on. 6 centers were formed, special hospitals with special departments for the murder of these patients. It was, as I said, complicated. They transported them across the whole of Germany. That's one of them. Another one, a castle that was transformed into a euthanasia center with in the basement they used to kill the patients. 200,000 German citizens are murdered. Patients are murdered by the medical staff, what they called euthanasia, which was actually medical murder, by the staff that was supposed to take care of them, because they were physically and mentally and otherwise considered as having lives as not worthy of living, and 5,000 children. We cannot there were some that refused. Probably on one hand we can count the number of people that refused, medical directors or personal physicians. On one hand, I think I can recount the names of people that we know refused to send their patients to their deaths. And then, of course, we have the final solution where they build the concentration camps. We haven't got there yet. Now we get there, to where we have the final solution. They decide what to do with the Jews, and they build the concentration camps, and they take this knowledge, this medical, the scientific knowledge and technology, and copy-paste it to the gas chambers and the crematoria in the concentration camps. On the right, on your left, is a gas chamber in one of those hospitals that was used to euthanize the German citizens. And on the right is the gas chamber at Auschwitz. The same technology, the same personnel were used to advise the concentration camp personnel how to use a gas chamber. They had experience from the T4, what they called the T4 Euthanasia Program, and the same personnel, medical personnel, were used in transferring them to the concentration camps. Doctors had other important jobs in the concentration camps. They were the ones, certainly at the beginning and in many other cases, to select people when they arrived on the ramp. Many cases were of doctors selecting people who could live and who were meant to be sent to the other side to die. Doctors made selections in what they called the hospital barracks. And of course, doctors performed the horrendous experimentation that we know about. Because of the experiments, they tried the doctors after the war, as I began, and the people that they could find, the people that they could prove. It wasn't easy. A lot of the records were destroyed, and it was incredibly difficult to find the people who were scattered all over Europe, and they had to prove that they had done what they had done. Part of the judgment of this special trial was what we know today as the Nuremberg Code. 10 points which define what is permissible in human subjects research. I think that it's fair to say that this is the strictest code that medicine has ever received. All subsequent codes, which we know today as Helsinki, that's what we use today, excuse me, all subsequent codes, all the Helsinki revisions of this code are all less stringent than Nuremberg as far as patient rights and patient protection are concerned. It's all been washed down a little bit. Nuremberg, its first and major concern was for patient rights, which is basically what Nuremberg did was it combined Hippocratic oath, Hippocratic rights with human rights. Since then, all the declarations have been less stringent than Nuremberg. I went to medical school a long time ago. Nobody told us about Nuremberg. Nobody learned about Nuremberg at medical school. It has been argued that all our bioethics actually has its roots in post-war Nuremberg. I think I would probably agree with that. But after Nuremberg, after 1947, the world was completely silent. As the whole world was silent about the Holocaust, people didn't want to listen, people didn't want to know, and of course it was really difficult to talk. The medical world was silent too. It was really uncomfortable to even think of doctors being like us. It was the Nazi doctors, as Stacey said, it was considered a code for barbarians. It was not a code for human beings. Those were the Nazi doctors. It was only a few of them, and they were crazy in any case, and we in the West could never ever do what the Nazis did. So that basically it was ignored, and it wasn't talked about. It was very uncomfortable to talk about doctors being the same, being made up of the same DNA as other doctors. But we know that 50% of the German doctors belong to the Nazi Party. Look at the other professions. 22% of the teachers, 24 of the musicians, 24 of the lawyers, 25 of the lawyers. Something attracted the doctors to the Nazi Party. Unlike other professions, there was something there that spoke the same language, that held the same power. In 2012, very late, but better late than never, the German Medical Association offered an apology. The crimes were not simply the acts of individual doctors, but rather took place with a substantial involvement of leading representatives of the Medical Association and medical specialist bodies, as well as with a considerable participation of eminent representatives of university medicine and renowned biomedical research faculties. This came out of Nuremberg. At one of their meetings, the German Medical Association issued this apology. The same Nuremberg where the rallies were held, the same Nuremberg where they passed the anti-Semitic laws in 1935, where they defined who was 1/4 Jewish, who was 1/2 Jewish, who was 3/4 Jewish, and who was not Jewish at all. The same Nuremberg, at the same Nuremberg, they issued this apology. And they continued. In contrast to still widely accepted views, the initiative for the most serious human rights violations did not originate from the political authorities at the time, but from the physicians themselves. These doctors were not mad, and they were not coerced. They did this and were fully aware of what they were doing. And what is so frightening is that they were convinced that they were doing what was right. So it is safe to say that the Holocaust differs from other forms of genocide in that it was genocide that involved the active participation of science and medicine. After the war, many of the leading positions in German and other medical professional organizations were held by physicians who had been active members of the Nazi Party or its affiliated organizations. Almost every aspect of contemporary ethics is influenced by what transpired or by the history of physician involvement in the Holocaust. Every aspect, not only the research, human subjects research aspect which was addressed at Nuremberg, but every aspect of contemporary ethics was abused by the Nazi German medical profession. Abortion, unethical research, dual loyalty, pharmaceutical ethics, whistleblowing. There are tens of ethical topics that we can talk about that were abused by the German medical or by the German physicians. In 2015, the Israeli Medical Association, together with the German Medical Association, issued this statement whereby they said, "These human rights violations perpetrated in the name of medicine under the Nazi regime continue to have repercussions to this day and raise questions concerning the way in which physicians perceive themselves, their professional behavior, and their medical ethics." Why they did what they did and how important it is to teach about it. The Holocaust began in depersonalizing the victims and ended in depersonalizing the perpetrators. The Nazi medical establishment began by depersonalizing their patients and ended in the perpetration of genocide. It's not easy to say that as a family physician. Stacey mentioned the case book. We firmly believe in personalizing the issues so that students can learn from these issues, and we were given the permission or the backing of UNESCO to publish the book, where we actually present personal cases of perpetrators, of victims, and I'm very grateful that we were actually given permission for half the book is about the Jewish doctors who worked in their professions in the various camps and ghettos and who were confronted with ethical dilemmas. And so we give a face and a name to these people, which makes it more personal, and people, so that the students can actually remember that we're basically made of the same DNA, all of us. By discussing personal cases, we believe that we can combat ignorance and prejudice. However monstrous the deeds were, it's important to remember that they were not monsters. They were human beings. They did monstrous things, but they were not monsters. And I want to end my talk by going back to Francis Galton, who was the man who coined the term eugenics. Francis Galton was a genius, and he also probably gave us the basis for statistics, and he also gave us the basis for fingerprinting, which today, of course, is used worldwide for everything. Yad Vashem, which is our Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, in 2016 had a competition. They have a yearly competition for artists to draw drawings so that they can use as an annual drawing. And this won the competition in 2016, and I found it appropriate to bring. It's a drawing of a fingerprint, but in the drawing of the fingerprint is barbed wire. Every single line there is not a fingerprint as we know, but is barbed wire. And I think that is a very good summation to a talk where doctors should remember that we are first and foremost human beings.